All right, please come to rest. Mr. Davis, give me 1 second. If you'll hit that real quick. I'm going to touch the temperature real quick, Mr. Davis, before you get started. All right. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Ryan Davis, and attorney for Mr. Wester. And just want to, again, thank everybody for their time and attention, especially last week. I know it was a long week, and it was a lot of things were going on, but without you, our system of justice wouldn't work. But we're getting to the point now where you are about to get the case, and you can finally not hear that instruction from the judge that says, don't talk amongst each other about it. You're soon going to be able to talk amongst each other and decide what the facts are in this case. Now, anything that I say and anything that the state says, again, like during our opening remarks and now during our closing remarks, are not evidence. We're trying to, again, kind of maybe point out some highlights or maybe some things that we think you should look at while you're doing your deliberations. But I also want to say, just because I didn't mention something doesn't mean it's not important. There may be things that you see or want to discuss that are very important that weren't touched on here. So don't take the fact that neither one of us mentioned something that's not important. You guys decide that during your deliberations. And as you've heard, and with the judge going through the verdict form, Mr. Wester has been charged with 67 criminal acts. And the first one of those is racketeering. There's two other counts I wanted to kind of bring up right now, which are three, 48, 49, and 60. Those relate to items that were found in Mr. Wester's patrol car. The other 63 charges relate to the 12 drug arrests that Mr. Wester made on those individuals. But in order to find Mr. Wester guilty of racketeering, you'll have to find Mr. Wester conducted or participated in at least 2 other incidents that are listed in the jury instructions that the judge read to you earlier. But also pay attention to the instruction that says an enterprise is an ongoing organization, formal or informal, that functions both as a continuing unit and has a common purpose of engaging in a course of conduct. So the question you'll have to answer is, what common purpose or course of conduct has the state proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Wester and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office participated in? What was that common course? I submit to you, there is no evidence of a common course. The state has alleged Mr. Wester committed official misconduct, perjury, fabricating evidence, possessing a controlled substance, possessing drug paraphernalia, and false imprisonment. These don't appear to be things that the Sheriff's Office would be engaging in. Again, counts 48, 49, and 60 relates to the items that were found in Mr. Wester's patrol car that he was processing when he was summoned into the office that day on August 1st, 2018, when he was suspended. Mr. Wester sat there in that stand and told you that he was at Alford Park, where these items were discovered by him and seized by him. The state is suggesting that he was never sent there because they can't locate a CAD note or a dispatch record. But think about the other records the state has not been able to produce. We heard testimony that Mike Hodges was in charge of reviewing the body cameras to make sure the needed videos were saved and others were deleted. And he was also supposed to be doing random checks of the cameras to make sure that they were being used properly. But you heard him, he has no reports, no notes, and not much recollection of what he did with those body cameras. And remember, we have different sets of body cameras too. And it was around late 2017 when they got the Axon cameras and this more official policy was instituted. We also heard from Caleb Corbin that videos were being deleted after 90 or 120 days. And getting to records, we also heard from Special Agent Chase she testified she received only 3 of the videos you saw from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Those were the videos related to Hazelwood, Van, and Day. The other videos you saw were provided by the state attorney's office. Well, where did the state attorney's office get them? Well, we heard they would have gotten them from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. So at a time when Agent Chase is going out and trying to collect these items, she goes to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Well, we know they would have had them at some time, but they're not able to produce them. Mike Hodges is supposed to be reviewing these body cameras, make sure they're being used properly, reviewing for what needs to be saved and what needs to be deleted. But we've got no records, no notes, no reports, anything on that. So don't let the fact that a report doesn't exist with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office to say that something didn't happen. Mr. Wester also told you about the call when he went to that park where the drugs were, where he found those drugs, and also about a separate call where he collected some beer cans. We saw some beer cans in a bag too. And Mr. Wester told you while he was doing that, traffic crash on I-10, bad weather coming through that day. And he had dispatch put those calls, that call at the park, in suspense. Other than Mr. Wester telling you about putting it in suspense, we've heard no other testimony about what that means or what that can do. But we do know that the CAD system has been updated since Mr. Wester left the office. Mr. Wester also testified that he told Mr. Arnold and Mr. Hodges that he was processing evidence in his car when they summoned him into the sheriff's office on August 1st of 2018. And the state made sure to recall those 2 witnesses. After we were done with our case, they made sure to recall Mr. Arnold and Mr. Hodges to get up on that stand and say, I don't remember him saying that. They don't recall a conversation from 3 years ago. And the follow-up question to that was, well, did you have a note or a report or anything? No. So again, here's another instance, no report, no notes, but trust us, it happened. Just like they had those videos at some point, because they got to the state attorney's office, but when they go back to check now, they can't find them. Agent Chase couldn't find them. And they want, the state is hammering about these, the body camera wasn't on, or there's only a partial, or we can't find anything. Well, who was in charge of that? We heard Mr. Wester's responsibility was to make sure that it got downloaded. After that, it's Mike Hodges' responsibility. But speaking about that little conversation, hey, processing evidence, don't worry about it, come on in. That was the last day that he worked as a sheriff's deputy. Fired, embarrassed, humiliated, kicked out, gun, badge taken. Very traumatic experience. Wouldn't it be likely that he would remember that conversation? Because what would Mr. Arnold and Mr. Hodges be concerned about? They're concerned about suspending him and getting him out of the building. That was their concern. But also, Mr. Wester testified, undisputed, that he was sitting in a secured parking lot at the sheriff's office, sitting there processing this evidence. Anybody could have walked by. Does that sound logical? No. If it's something he sees, He's in his car. He told you he uses his car. That's his office. That's where he was processing the evidence. But the state, they want you to believe that that wasn't happening, and this stuff was hidden in his car for use later. And again, the phrase again, common sense. Use your common sense. Look back at the other videos. Look at the Teresa Odom video. At one point, there's 3 officers standing there behind his trunk. The Joshua Clenny video, the backup officer that's there, at one point gets into Mr. Wester's car and moves it. There's other deputies standing all around his car. Does it make sense for him to be hiding stuff? They're going in and out of his car. At any time, somebody else could have gone in there. So common sense, would you hide your criminal activity in a spot where police officers are going to be coming in and out of? So that's why I said during my opening statement, I'm saying it again, inspect the case. Don't just look over at it. Oh yeah, that looks nice. No. Got to look under the hood, kick the tires, check the belts. Is it really as good as it appears? And there was also in the car this bottle with some marijuana that was found in the first aid bag. Again, at any time, another officer might have had to grab that bag out of his car. So does it make sense for him to hide stuff there? And we also saw Mike Hodges in that search of the car. You see him, that bag, that first thing that he touches, that's the bag that he reaches into to put his gloves on. He grabs gloves out of there to conduct the search and looks in that bag, but doesn't see anything in there. But somebody else does later. But about these items in his car, in his patrol car, I'll submit to you that you're going to find that the state has failed to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that he was possessing any of those items outside of his official duties. Because you heard in the jury instructions, with these possession charges, if you find that Mr. Wester was acting within his official duties, he's not guilty. He's allowed to possess that stuff that he seized on these calls. But don't let the lack of records from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office convince you otherwise. I'm going to move on to a little bit about the 12 individuals. And once you get back there to start your deliberations, you'll be able to see and look, and like how Mr. Williams said, and how the case was presented was not in chronological order. But I think there's some things to learn by looking at it in chronological order. So the first stop, the first person in chronological order is Maria Turner on July 14th of 2017. And the last one is Kimberly Hazelwood on June 7th of 2018. So almost a year. Well, we know that up until late 2017, Mike Hodges was the one in charge of the body cams and making sure videos were preserved. And the videos that we don't have, or the cases where there's no videos, Maria Turner in 2017. Reginald Williams, August of 2017. Benjamin Bowling, October of 2017. And Derek Benefield, October of 2017. Now we know from hearing from Caleb Corbett, it was near the end of 2017, they had some year-end money, and that's when they upgraded their body cam system to the Axon system. So the first video from 2018 is Richard Driggers, and we see body cam footage. Next one is Teresa Odom, body cam footage from the defendant. The next is Joshua Clenny. Now we don't see body cam footage from the defendant, Mr. Wester, but we do from the backup officer. But at the end of that video, when they've got the undercover agent there, and they're going to talk to him, you see Mr. Wester say, "Let me turn this off," and he pushes the button. How does that relate to everything else? Well, we also heard testimony that Mr. Wester had a camera that malfunctioned. There was something wrong with one of his Axon cameras that was sent back, and he was issued a new one. But we don't have any records about that. Just testimony. So it's not clear when that camera would have been sent back. But as you look going into 2018, you're getting more videos, longer videos from Mr. Wester. And another thing that I did, it may be helpful for you too, though, when you're doing it, a lot of the charges in the jury instructions have the person's name. You've heard the judge say those names over and over and over again. But on some of the possession charges, it's just by date. Well, you can see, you can figure out the dates that the people were arrested. So I've got the 12 listed out here with each charge as it relates to them. So it may be helpful to go through each one individually with the charges, because it's not all or nothing. You have to look at each and every one of those 67 charges. But it may be better to group them together by these 12 individuals that are claiming Mr. Wester planted this stuff on them. Like with Maria Turner, you'll see that counts 2, 14, and 26 relate to her. Or Steve Van, you'll see that counts 10, 22, 34, 44, 57, and 65 relate to him. So as you discuss each one of those, you want to look at the charges that relate to each one of them individually. I went to lick my thumb to... Still getting used to these masks after a year, sorry. I wanted to talk a little bit about now in order as they were presented to us, these 12 individuals. And the first person we heard from was Joshua Emanuel. And state's saying, oh, if it was right there, he would have seen it. You never would have said that. Or did he think maybe Mr. Wester wouldn't see it? Or he forgot it was in there. But we also brought in Trooper O'Pride, who was right there the whole time. O'Pride was testifying, and he's about here. He's about this far away watching this on Highway 231, middle of the day, good lighting. Mr. Wester's wearing short sleeve shirt. And he's saying, planted a syringe. I'm using my pen as an example, probably about the same size. O'Brien didn't see him palming anything, hide anything, acting unusual. And this, again, we're talking about a small car, big guy, He can't get all the way in there. No, probably didn't see him reaching for his pockets or putting anything in there. He was standing right there. And Mr. Emanuel testified. I asked him a question, well, about this notice to appear. Only person that got that's because he's a family friend with Mike Hodges. But I also asked him about, well, you were eventually put on some type of pretrial release. Any issues with that? And what did he say? No, that was easy. Called in once a week, no problem. Apparently it wasn't so easy because I had to show him the warrant that was issued for his arrest for even failing to comply with that. Reginald Williams, 2017, before the Axon cameras. Came out, he was a convicted felon. He doesn't remember if he pled or what happened to his case. But Mr. Wester told you, I searched, I smelled something, I searched, and in a compartment in that lunchbox, found that methamphetamine. The next one was Stephen Van. When he was on the stand, when questioned about being pulled over because of crossing the double yellow line, he said, no way. But in the video it was clear, he's like, yeah, front end's out of line. Said earlier in that day, he had somebody named Crystal in his car, which Mr. Wester testified he knew that Crystal, and she was a known subject. Mr. Van had also just recently, within a few weeks, been released from prison because of methamphetamine. But because he protests, it can't be true, according to the state. And I had the rest of that video played so you could see that, to how it would relate to other searches that you see. Because yes, Mr. Wester found the methamphetamine in Mr. Van's center console, but he did complete the search of the vehicle. And remember, Mr. Van's vehicle, big SUV, and when he gets in that back seat, he bends over to reach down, and that's when the body camera is on the seat and you don't see anything. And the state wants you to conclude when he does that, he's hiding something. Well, what would he have to hide? He's already found the methamphetamine there. And that's the same way you see him search the back seat of that big SUV that the Fears are driving. And it's also the same way you see him search the back seat of that big truck with Penn and Shaw. That's the one you just saw the video about. We didn't hear any testimony. That's just the one you saw the video about the syringes. Next one is Trevor Day. And in this one, we do have partial video of when that stop is happening from Mr. Wester. But you see, it just kind of stops. That could be during the time with that Axon camera where it was malfunctioning. But you also hear on that video Mr. Wester calling for another officer. He called for another officer. It's not that they're just showing up and he has to try to do something quick, as the state was just suggesting with Mrs. Odom or Mrs. Hazelwood, because other officers are there, but he's calling. He's calling for somebody else. So if he's planting evidence, why would he be calling for other officers to be there? Trevor Day also said, didn't know that Kimberly Wood had marijuana in the car. That's what he said. But Kimberly Wood said, we were all smoking it that day. Conflict in the testimony. And the other officer that was on the scene of that stop was Deputy Tarter. Right there. Nothing unusual, no red flags, and that's who Mr. Wester called to back him up. The next person we hear from was Richard Driggers. If you remember, Mr. Driggers, during, I believe it was when the officer that was testifying after, the state was asking about an unsigned report and trying to establish that Mr. Wester wrote the report even though what they were putting into evidence he hadn't signed. But if you recall, yes, the report was put in, a signed one. Mr. Wester did sign that report. I don't know if the state's intention was to try to show that maybe he was trying not to sign something because he didn't want to attest to something that wasn't true, but he did. He signed every report. Every report was signed. When Mr. Drigger was testifying, he said he hadn't smoked marijuana in that car in at least a month, but on the video, he says it was the day before. Mr. Driggers knows what meth is because he told you he had used it 6 or 7 years ago. In the state, making the suggestion that it's Mr. Wester that's always asking, well, who else do you have in the car? What else is going on? Trying to get him talking. But in the video, you'll see it was the backup officer that asked, who do you have riding around here with meth? Who's in your car with meth? And Mr. Maloney, who was with FHP when he testified, used to be with the sheriff's office, he was the backup officer on that case. No red flags, nothing unusual. That's who Mr. Wester called in to help. The next one presented was Joshua Clenny. At the time, he's on probation for burglary, doesn't have a driver's license, said his dad has 5 or 6 people in and out of that truck at any time. And he also tells you, or he says on the video, I'm the most honest person in the world. I'm the most honest person in the world. I wouldn't lie to you. But yet he's also been convicted of 3 crimes of dishonesty. It was also during the Joshua Clenny the Deputy Carlberg, you see him get in and move Mr. Wester's car. So he's getting in there where they're trying to say he's got these preloaded test kits ready to go. But Carlberg never says, hey, Zach, I need to move your car. He just gets in and moves it. Which shows that's what happens on these stops. There was no expectation of privacy that Mr. Wester had in that patrol car. Other people are in and out. So why would he hide stuff in there? And Deputy Carlberg, again, nothing unusual about the stop, nothing unusual about what Mr. Wester did. And he also said it's not unusual for someone to deny the drugs were theirs. And he also told us that meth is still a very big problem here in Jackson County. Now, the next witness that testified after Mr. Clenny was Randy Howe, probation officer, to come in to testify that Mr. Clenny passed a drug test on February 5th of 2018. Well, what does that tell us? That he hadn't used drugs on February 5th of 2018. The date that Mr. Wester pulled him over was March 4th of 2018, almost a month later. What does passing a drug test a month earlier have to do with possessing drugs a month later? The next one presented was Benjamin Bowling, and that stop was on October 2nd of 2017. Maybe around the time we got the new Axon cameras, maybe not. We're not sure. There's been no testimony of when those actually went into service. But in any event, Mr. Hodges was the one still responsible to making sure those videos were saved. And we know that Mr. Bowling has had his issues because he'd recently been released from prison, only had his prison ID. He's a convicted felon. And his passenger, at some point, Ms. Smith, tries to claim the drugs were hers. After their testimony, the state called Laura Parrish, who used to be an assistant state attorney, to testify that on 2 occasions, Mr. Wester didn't show up for a deposition. But she also told you it wasn't unusual for officers not to show up to depositions during that time. The next one presented is Teresa Odom. And Mr. Wester sat right there on that stand and told you what happened with that case. Asked for consent to search. You see it on the video. She gets out of the car. He goes to search. But remember, we wanted to make sure that you saw something. And I think it's important. So Odom reaches outside of the car to open the door. She reaches outside. Doesn't use the handle that's right there. Reaches outside. That's why we made sure that Deputy Heike's video was played so you could see that. Mr. Wester told you he noticed it too. So that's why he checked that area where the door handle is on the inside to see if it was working. And that's where he found this other piece of plastic, a bag or something. And that's what you see in his hand. And again, we heard testimony about that. It's not unusual for somebody to deny knowledge. It seemed like the only thing surprising in that video from the officers when you hear them discussing it is not that, oh, you found drugs, but it was the type of drug. Because you hear when the officers say, oh, Teresa, I thought she was a crack lady. And she had the tears while she was testifying. But we see her at the jail waiting, and she's still joking about the $5. Talking about the taillight. And at her first court date, she enters a plea. And the state also brought in those enhanced photos of trying to show what it is in his hand, which I submit to you is inconclusive. But we brought in some more of those photos of when Mr. Wester's pulling that bag of meth out of her purse, that gray hair wrapped around it. So that'll be back there for you too if you want to look at those photos as well. As Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. And would Teresa Odom lie? She's also previously been convicted of a crime of dishonesty. The next one presented chronologically, or not chronologically, but during the trial, we jump back to 2017 again with Derek Benefield. In October of 2017, might have been around that time where the cameras are switching. But also 4-time convicted felon, 2 crimes of dishonesty, and he also entered a plea, no challenge. The next in order presented was James Fears. Now we're getting into June of 2018. Full video from Mr. Wester. Other officers on scene. Nobody batting an eye about these protests. Because why? Well, Mr. Wester and Mr. Lee are discussing, didn't we pull this guy over a couple weeks ago? And I talked to Mr. Fears about that. Was that you? Yeah, that was me. Another woman in the car had methamphetamine, but this time it's not mine. And don't worry about that charge I have back from 2004 for manufacturing methamphetamine. Mr. Wester planted everything this time. Don't worry about my past, or I was even with a meth user just a couple weeks ago in my car. And then the last one presented is Kimberly Hazelwood. Pulled over legitimately. Another officer on scene. Dog goes around the car. Dog alerts on the car. Ms. Hazelwood tells us her husband was the one that bought the Excedrin. The drugs are found in the Excedrin bottle, sitting right there in front of her. And if it wasn't hers, she's also telling us that, well, my brother-in-law was sitting in there just not too long ago, and I know he used to do meth. And when her husband, Jeremy Hazelwood, testified, he said he doesn't remember her using Excedrin. But on the video, she's the one that says that he bought the Excedrin. But the dog alerted on that car. And while Ms. Hazelwood didn't have any prior convictions, Mr. Hazelwood did. The next person after that is Dylan Jackson, who previously was the canine, but now he's in the narcotics unit. There the whole time. He takes the dog around. The dog alerts Mr. Wester search. That gives them probable cause to search that car. He also tells us he's not surprised someone would deny the drugs were theirs. And he tells you now, now he is a narcotics investigator in Jackson County, and he tells you, comes across it almost daily. And he's not the only officer that testified about meth in this county. It's a problem. Why would he have to plan anything? It's out there to find. state called Seifert from FDLE, the biology section, talked about the DNA, touch DNA, and what it can affect it and what couldn't affect it. Whole explanation about that. But at the end of the day, it was her call if they wanted to actually test the stuff or not, and she said no. We're not going to test it. And something that I said to one of the other witnesses, I would point out here, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think that was more prevalent with the next witness, which was the Ms. Mick Glamory Evans, the latent print person, and talking about, why it might be difficult to get prints on and off something, different materials, time of year, sweaty palms, how hard you touch something. I think she was the one talking about the screwdriver. But again, just because you didn't find evidence on it doesn't mean evidence wasn't on there at some point. Mr. Wester went one by one through each and every stop and arrest. And you heard from many other officers that saw nothing unusual, no red flags with anything Mr. Wester did. And you heard many of those same officers that were not surprised at all that those suspects denied ownership of the drugs and the paraphernalia that Mr. Wester found in their cars. And you can rewatch the videos, you'll have them back there. And you'll not see one of those officers show any concern about the protest from the people that Mr. Wester was arresting. And Mr. Wester was able to articulate to you the probable cause that he needed to effectuate those arrests. Went through every single one of them with you. And you also heard many of them, these people entered pleas. Some of them, just a couple weeks later, first time they can get in court, go ahead and enter a plea. Nobody challenged anything in a courtroom. And nobody filed any complaints with the sheriff's office. The burden that the state have to overcome is beyond a reasonable doubt. And I talked to you a little bit during my opening, the different levels of proof. Probable cause, preponderance of the evidence, clear and convincing, beyond a reasonable doubt. So what we're talking about on these stops to make these arrests is probable cause. What you have to find beyond a reasonable doubt. There is no direct evidence of Mr. Wester doing anything wrong. Not one person testified they saw him do anything. Not one person said they saw him doing anything unusual. And that's not just the people who are saying he planted something. They didn't see him do anything, but it's also the other officers that were there watching. Did it again. When you're weighing the evidence, the judge went over this with you. there's certain things that, you should look at beyond, obviously using your common sense, but he talks about the instructions say, did the witness seem to have an accurate memory? Was the witness honest and straightforward in answering the attorney's questions? Did the witness have some interest in how the case should be decided? Most of the people that got up there and testified also said, yeah, I'm suing. I'm suing. And at least one of them said, yes, a conviction here would definitely help my civil case. So is there an interest? Yes. And what is that? Money. Has the witness been offered or received any money, preferred treatment, or other benefit in order to get the witness to testify? Well, that other benefit could be their civil suits and what they're expecting to get from that. And the instructions also tell you whether the state has met its burden of proof does not depend upon the number of witnesses that it's called or the number of exhibits it has offered. Because yes, there's been a lot of witnesses and a lot of exhibits. But instead, upon the nature and quality of the evidence presented. The nature and quality of the evidence. That's why I was talking to you about those numbers during opening. And I think those numbers are important. Over 30 felony convictions and crimes of dishonesty among these people. The civil suits. What's the motive? Every one of these people that was up here and testified, yeah, their charges were dropped. Most of them are suing. Think about that when you're evaluating their testimony. In addition to their crimes of dishonesty, their felony convictions, the other officers that were there on scene watching. When there's a news story, you hear about the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why. Well, the who, in this case, are these people that are claiming Mr. Wester planted evidence on them. And the what is that, the planting of the evidence. The when they were stopped. Where? Here in Jackson County. The last W there is why. Why? Why would Mr. Wester do this? Is it because of the extra $1,000 to $1,500 he could get if he becomes a narcotics investigator? Well, he told you you can work off-duty details. I think at the parks, he also talked about the college. So he can make that in a month on his days off. He doesn't need to get this $1,000 a year raise by being a narcotics investigator. Let's talk about the prestige of the narcotics unit. So Mr. Wester told you he interviewed for a position as an investigator with the Criminal Investigations Division, not narcotics. That was never rebutted by the state. There's no evidence to say that that didn't happen. Or could his motivation have been, as he told you, to help rid this county of a serious problem? And that's why he was proactive. That's why he would, if he wasn't on a call, that's why he was pulling people over and not just sitting and waiting for the next one taking a break. He was proactive because he has seen what this has done to this community and people that he knows. He told you, friends and family, that he knows that have been affected by this. He wanted to help stop it. several other officers talk about the continued problem of methamphetamine in this community. Like Dylan Jackson. So why would he have to fabricate? It's out there. It's out there. Dylan Jackson sees it almost daily. But on the flip side, with those 5 W's to the people here testifying, the why is more obvious. They need to stick with their stories. They've already had their charges dropped. They're suing. That's why. So what we're asking you to do is to use your common sense. Inspect the case, reflect on the testimony, look at the evidence, watch the videos if you need to, discuss it, and we submit to you when you do that, you're going to have no choice but to find Mr. Wester not guilty. Thank you.
All right, it is not quite 1 o'clock, it's 12:55. We're going to take a lunch break, let you get regrouped for the afternoon here. Be back in the jury room at 1:45. Again, be back in the jury room at 1:45. Leave your notebooks in your chairs. Take your badges. You still are not allowed to deliberate, nor are you allowed to discuss this with each other, nor any third party. Don't do any research. Don't look up anything. Don't look at any newspaper articles. Watch the news. Talk with anybody about the case. Be back in that jury room again at 1:45, and we're going to get started promptly. Thank you.
All rise.
All right, please come to rest. Mr. Williams, anything we need to discuss before we take our lunch recess?
No, sir.
Mr. Davis?
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll be out, be ready to go promptly at 1:45. Thank you.